Hey guys, Priz here, and today we're going to talk about Prism, Awakener of Sol, or specifically, a version of Prism that didn't play Tome of Divinity before it got banned. The reason I'm making this video is about the question I get asked the most often, which is, how do you possibly beat Guardians without Vestige? And the answer, of course, is just looping. The goal of this video is to chat about the perfect setup for the Vestigeless loop, how to execute it, and what I think about while I'm playing the game towards these endgame states. First, let's talk about equipment. Halo, Luminaris, Phantasmal Footsteps. These are all great pieces of equipment for Prism, and I don't feel like I need to talk about them too much. Dreamweavers is a bit of inconsistent soul generation, which is something we'll talk about later. Tunic is a really strong value engine in Prism. It's been a really powerful card in Prism in the past. It lets you play yellow Spectra Auras, which cost 4 off a total of 2 cards in total, being a blue and the aura itself. It provides a steady stream of value while you set up your endgame, and it also actually provides a safety net in that endgame state. But we'll talk about that later. What do you need to actually execute a loop without Vestige? Let's talk about the board state required, the requirements. This is the area that I think Vestige decks overcompensate on. I'm not interested in looping my opponent infinitely, usually with the help of Genesis. I'm interested in looping them just enough to kill them, in a way that I can set up consistently in every single game. This leads us to the following requirements. We need an Arc Light Sentinel in deck, and an Arc Light Sentinel in the graveyard. We need a Figment of War in play, a Figment of Rebirth in play, and a great library of Solana in play. Sorry guys, this card is actually required to loop in this configuration. The final requirement is 12 cards in Sol. This count is somewhat arbitrary. 12 is the sweet spot where I think it consistently kills Guardians, but you can get away with more or less in Sol as needed. Setting up your arc lights and your figments in your library in the right zones, it's something that'll happen naturally over the course of the game. So let's talk about the harder part, being the Sol requirements. I split Sol generation into consistent effects and inconsistent effects. Your consistent effects are your cards like Genesis, your Soul Shields, your Merciful Retribution, and of course, our Halo. These cards, when played correctly, should all generate at least 1 soul each. Each Genesis gets 1 soul, and then your opponent kills it. Nice. Soul Shields all generate 1 soul each. Merciful and Halo are both 1 soul each. But that only actually gives us 10, and like I said before, we need 12 at the least. This leads us to our inconsistent soul generation. Merciful actually fits into this category as well, as the best way to play it, in my opinion, is with a Phantasm trigger on the stack, waiting to resolve, which guarantees 2 cards in Sol off 1 Merciful when your opponent is inevitably forced to deal with it. In a similar manner, Halo usually fetches Triumph, which I try to use to force through a Herald hit, which results in another card in Sol. After that, we've got Dreamweavers, which, like I said earlier, are an inconsistent piece of Sol generation. These are some of the easiest ones to use, particularly in combination with some of our other inconsistent Sol generation effects. These are our best friend, Light of Sol. We're playing a deck that's, mostly yellow and a library. It's very consistent, and you don't really care too much about which cards you put in Sol once you have these 3 permanents in play. After that, we've got 3 copies of Yellow Angelic Wrath and 3 copies of Yellow Celestial Reprimand. These are both also inconsistent Sol generation, but whenever they do work, they normally result in a card in Sol. They also make it a little bit harder for your opponent to play around the tools you have available. You get to punish your opponent popping you, your opponent not popping you, and I mean in combination with Dreamweavers and Erudition, Angelic Wrath is incredibly strong and lets you set up tempo plays in the mid-game. You'll note that the loop itself doesn't actually require any yellow Spectra auras in play. This is deliberate, and the goal is to make it significantly harder for your opponents to interact with your endgame. Your opponent can't interact with figments at all. To my knowledge, there isn't a card in the game that can remove a figment once it's in play. These only leave play once you flip them into an angel and they get warded away. Great Library can be interacted with, but for the most part I've found that the decks that need to be able to kill Library can't consistently run enough yellows to be able to kill Library. That means that we get to use Spectra as a bit of a different role throughout the game. I use them to build Sol, and more importantly, generate space. If your opponent doesn't kill the yellow Spectres throughout the game, they will die to them, and you need to make sure that you're playing the deck in a way that causes you to be able to kill your opponent with your yellow Spectres if they disrespect your board state. You don't need to worry about saving your Genesis for an infinite loop. Your only goals are to build that 12 Sol, get some chip damage in, and preserve your blue count, which is actually the final part of the loop. Let's now talk about the loop itself. Everything's set up. We've got our permanents in play, we've got an Arc Light Engrave, we've got our Sol, and we've drawn an Arc Light as well as 2 yellows and 2 blues. Just like every other loop, we're going to start by pitching 6 resources to play an Arc Light. We're then going to pitch a Light of Sol. What we reveal doesn't actually matter, but you can, once you get used to this configuration of the loop, you can use this Light of Sol to actually fix your stack as you progress through your loop. Reveal the top card, doesn't matter. If we need more Sol, we can put it in. Every single card in Sol represents 14 damage at the end of the loop. This yellow has been pitched to flip Avalon, and then we attack with Avalon and banish a card to put Arc Light back on top of our deck. We pass the turn, and we've got 2 yellows in our pitch zone, so we get to draw 5 off Great Library. We're going to draw an Arc Light, and because we've been so careful keeping our blue count high, we're going to draw 2 more yellows and 2 more blues alongside it. You'll notice that this means we're functionally pitching 4 card hands. We're just trying to keep our yellows and our blues together so that we always have the resources necessary to execute the loop. Our opponent kills Arc Light, we tick up Tunic. This turn, we play an Arc Light again, pitching 2 blues. We get to attack with Avalon, banishing a card to put Arc Light back on top. And then our last card, this time, awakens Bellona. Bellona is the key to scaling this loop in a way that lets you actually kill your opponent. Going to draw 5. Tick up Tunic. Our opponent has killed Arc Light. And the same way, we're just going to pitch 2 blues, play an Arc Light, and this time we're going to attack with Bellona first and banish a card. This means that we get to start pumping the angels. Up until this point, we've attacked for 4, 2 turns in a row, but now we start attacking for 5 plus 5. After that, banish a card, put Arc Light back on top, pass the turn. Our opponent kills Arc Light, Tunic doesn't tick up anymore, and we're just going to do the same thing. Every single time we draw 2 blues and 2 yellows, we get to play Arc Light, attack with Bellona, pump the team, and attack with Avalon to continue the loop. Every time you don't draw 2 blues is when this loop gets a little bit harder to execute. Oh, that has actually happened now. Our opponent kills Arc Light. We only draw 1 blue, which means we are 1 resource short, and this is why I'm talking about Tunic as a safety net. This time, we get to play Arc Light with a resource floating of 2 yellows and a blue. We get to attack with Bellona, pumping the team, banishing a card, and we still have 1 resource floating. And now Tunic provides the last resource necessary to swing with Bellona and put an Arc Light back on top. This is the final version of the loop, and at this point, every single card in Sol represents 14 damage. If you have more cards in Sol, if you've gotten, lucky off your Light of Sol hits, or your opponent has lifted Genesis around over the course of the game, you can continue buffing your team, and that just means the loop kills them faster. But at this point, we've attacked for 4, and then for 4, and then for 5 plus 5, and then for 6 plus 6, for 7 plus 7, and then 7 plus 7 for every single card in our Sol. Once you keep in mind that your opponent is forced to hold at least one card in order to deal with Arc Light, and if they don't deal with Arc Light, you're just off to the races, then they're going to leak damage. And there's just, you only get 4 cards in hand, they're going to leak damage, at least 5 a turn in this in-game state. And you will kill them eventually once you put that damage in combination with any chip you've managed to get in over the course of the game. You use Tunic as a way to be able to fix your deck ratios and kind of cheat on your blue count a little bit. The goal is always to keep your blue count as low as possible so that your red count is high enough to be able to kill your aggro matchups quickly. And yeah, I've found that this configuration is able to kill even the tankiest decks in the format. The only other thing that we really need to talk about, the last complication, is what happens when your opponent destroys your library or runs very specific tech like Time Skippers. The best advice I can give here is that you still have the agency. Because your loop doesn't depend on specific permanents in play, other than your figments in your library, you can just delay it for as long as you like. Or at least, as long as you have cards and deck and life to work with. I do my best to bait out Time Skippers, and for the most part, presenting an Arc Light Sentinel in play, as well as Soraya, your draw 2 angel behind it, is enough to force the Time Skippers. You still are able to threaten the loop in the mid-game if your opponent gives you the space to do so. You just need to be really, really careful about when you do it, and you need to be able to have that judgment call on when the loop, in whatever form is available to you, is enough damage to push the win. Library is tougher, but honestly, it doesn't happen often. The decks that you need to loop against, I only loop against Guardians and Assassins for the most part. Assassin is really bad at dealing with Spectra, and those decks struggle to run enough yellows to consistently kill Library. When it has happened to me in the past, I've found a way to win every single one of those games. Prism is a flexible hero, Illusionist is a flexible class, and despite all of this planning, sometimes things don't go the way you expect and you need to be able to adjust on the fly. Luckily, you're playing a hero that can do that. I hope that this helps everyone that's dooming about the Tome of Divinity ban, even if it just shows that this isn't the end of the absolutely unfair endgame that is an infinite source of Arc Light Sentinels. Let me know if you have any questions, but otherwise, just loop 'em.